I'd like to welcome everybody to Saratoga Springs Planning Commission. Today is August 24th, 2017, and we'd like to start out with the Pledge of Allegiance. Would the audience please arise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? Pledge allegiance, flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. All right, let's have roll call. Start over here with Commissioner Steele.
Troy Cunningham.
David Funk.
Kirk Wilkins.
Ken Kilgore.
Brian Chapman.
And we have a quorum. Kevin Thurman.
Gordon Miner.
Sarah Knighton.
David Stroud.
All right, thank you. Hey, Nora. Do we not have any room for her up here? Okay. All right, let's go right on. This is a public meeting, and we have set aside time to hear the public comment about items that are not on the agenda tonight. If you have something that you'd like to come forward with that is not on the agenda, please come forward and state your name and address for the record, and keep your comments to about 3 minutes. Anyone come forward? We're going to close public comment at this time. And let's go on to item number 4. This is a public meeting for affected entities. It's an amendment to the annexation expansion area of the city's annexation policy plan. And we'll turn the time over to Nora for our presentation.
The item for you is an amendment to our annexation policy plan expansion map boundary. And we have a policy plan that was originally adopted in 2003, updated in 2012 and 2016. The 2016 update was similar to the update that is happening now. It's just a change in the map itself. The text as it exists is not changing as a part of this amendment. It's only a portion of the map. Tonight is a public meeting, and the folks that have been noticed for tonight's meeting are all of the affected entities, and those include the special service districts, those kinds of affected entities. And the purpose is to hear from those public entities and then have you direct me to make any modifications or changes or answer any questions based upon that input. This is it's different than our normal process because it's almost entirely the process is laid out by state law. And so the noticing is a little bit different, the meetings are a little bit different, and tonight is a public meeting and then comes a public hearing. So it's unusual. So this is the approximate location of the proposed amendment to the boundary. Seeing quite a bit of annexation activity in the last few years. Here's a little map that shows some of the annexations that we have been looking at in this vicinity. The one on the left with all the pretty colors is known as the McLaughlin annexation. The one in the middle with the green running through it is the Pirelli annexation. Both of those have been protested by Lehigh City and will be heard by the Utah County Boundary Commission maybe next month, hopefully. But those are in the process and they are under protest. as well as the Lakeview annexation, which is the one on the right. And that is the one where we are doing a boundary change to, when I got down to writing the staff report for this particular annexation request, I noticed that the annexation boundary did not include that little top piece. The black sort of semi-dotted line is the annexation boundary the way it is today. And so we're proposing an amendment to change that to include that little piece. Uh-oh. That little piece. It's actually a portion of one parcel, and it's owned by the Webbs currently. It's not a separate parcel, it's a portion of one parcel. As I mentioned, the process is a little bit different. Tonight we have the public meeting and to hear from, and the next step is for a planning commission public hearing, which will be noticed as most of our public hearings are noticed. And that the staff report says September 7th, but the meeting is really September 14th before the planning commission. And you will be asked to make a recommendation to the city council, either at that time or at some time, but you'll be asked to take an action. And then tentatively, the city council public hearing is scheduled for October 3rd, 2017. That's briefly what's being proposed. I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Thank you, Nora. Now, given that this is a public meeting, do we need to open it up for public comment?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's do that at this time. Item number 4, which is an amendment for annexation expansion area of the city's annexation policy plan. If you have any comments, please come forward, state your name and address for the record, and keep your comments about 3 minutes. We'll open public comment on number 4. Okay, since I don't see any public comment for item number 4, we'll close. Yes, this is the time if you want to come forward. Okay, we're going to close public comment at this time, and we'll open it up to the Planning Commission for comment. Commissioner Kilgore.
So can I just say something really quickly? This isn't any sort of a deciding commission or even really discussion. The purpose of this meeting is only to receive comment from public or affected entities that we've sent the notice out to. The comment period is also for the next 10 days after this meeting. So they can provide comments up, for 10 days after this meeting. So you really don't need to discuss it if you don't want to. If you want to just move on, because you will, the decision is actually made at the next meeting after the opportunity for the affected entities to weigh in on this.
But if you have additional information that you want me to provide at that meeting, now would be a good time to let me know so I can do that.
My question is about the text. I want
Clarification about the existing text?
Yeah.
Before we go on to that, could we, for an email or a contact person who they can provide feedback to, who should they contact?
Well, the notice to affected entities provided that information already for the statute. And the annexation policy plan, the only thing that's being proposed to amend is the boundary at this point. The rest of the policy plan, since that was not noticed to affected entities, really can't be changed at this point. You can direct staff to come back with another policy plan amendment, but we'd have to send out, again, another notice to the affected entities, if that makes sense.
Okay. Commissioner Kilgore, go ahead and ask your question.
There's a 4F, the previous page. Next page after that is staff findings. Oh, yeah. That's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so it says Utah County is the second.
If you look back on page 4, one of the criteria under little 4 or big 4 is that it's to be guided by the principles set forth in 035, and that applies only to first-class cities. So that's what that little comment refers to. Okay. All right. Yes. I believe there's already an existing subdivision there. Let me see if one of my maps shows that. Yeah. So let me see. No, there is not another subdivision, and I think that's already within the city of Lehigh, if I recall. Yeah, that may be. There have been discussions going on with some of those property owners, and we are also talking internally with staff as to whether we want to make some sort of more wholesale changes to our annexation policy boundary, including looking to the south and maybe looking a little bit more to the north and to the east. And we will probably be back to you with those. At this point, we are just doing this one, and we wanted to move it forward and not get caught up in kind of the bigger global discussion. That's the current. Yes. That's correct, but to the left, that whole piece to the left is part of the Pirelli annexation. So it creates a little bit of a peninsula, but it will actually be connected and not create an island. The light gray area. Yes, yes. The boundary, the lower boundary is the city boundary. The upper boundary is the annexation policy declaration boundary. There are two.
Okay, so it's not.
Correct. It will be a peninsula, right? And we can't really compel property owners who are using their land as ag coming into the city without their consent. So we can certainly have conversations, which we've had with most of these property owners, but we can't force them to annex at this point.
Commissioner Kilgore, just as a point, you're asking about the map. Yeah, the light gray area north of this area, that is still Utah County. Then the darker you see on the north, up that's Lehigh. Yeah.
Nora, just a point of clarification. The proposed annexation line that is in that orange and yellow striped area.
Yes.
In your presentation, you mentioned that that is a part of a parcel.
Yes, that's part of the parcel, the pink.
Okay.
So that's all the pink is one parcel under one parcel number.
Okay.
And it's just that little piece of it that wasn't included in our annexation boundary.
Thank you.
For whatever reason.
I just wanted to comment because I will not be here for the next meeting. And I just want the rest of the commissioners to know that I am in favor of this. So just since I won't be here.
Well, was this your last meeting? Hope you enjoy your sushi. Did we have any other questions or clarification before I move on? Okay, I believe that we've satisfied what we need to do. Thank you for your presentation, Nora. And let's move on to item number 5. This is a continued item from July 13th and August 10th, 2017. This is a legislative recommendation for proposed code amendments to Title 19. It's city-initiated We'll turn the time over to Sarah for our updates.
Okay. Well, we got a lot of feedback at our last meeting from everybody, and so the draft that you see before you is a consolidated effort to put all of that feedback into one code, and then obviously we would like your feedback on what's been drafted. So the highlighted information met last, and the things that aren't highlighted are also amendments, however they were included in the last draft. So what you're seeing for 1902, we're modifying the definition for public buildings. And then the two sections of code that are being proposed for amendments are 1905 supplementary regulations related to wireless telecommunication towers, and then 1915 conditional use permits, and we are adding language related to public utility sites and public building sites. And so a summary of what you're seeing related to the pole changes is listed here. The existing version of the code has a specific height listed for each zone, and some of the comment that we got last time was, well, if we don't want it in residential zones, let's not be misdirecting with the asterisks about the 200 feet distance and everything like that. So some of the changes that you're seeing tonight, we've taken out the list of heights by zone, and the proposed regulation regulates height by property size. And so what you're seeing in there is a table related to property size. So if there are poles on property less than 1 acre, then the underlying zone, the height of the underlying zone would apply. If the property ranges from 1 to 5 acres in size, the pole may be up to 80 feet in height. And then if the property is 5 acres or more in size, the pole may be up to 100 feet. And then utility meters are exempted from the lot size requirements, and that's, the city will be putting in poles to read utility meter in the city to get a meter read. And then there's also been so there's setback requirements. There was some discussion on that last time. There was minimal setbacks proposed or no setbacks proposed for public utility sites. However, and that was intended to apply to cell towers as well. This draft separates cell towers from public utility sites. So cell towers have their own section and requirements that are separate from the public utility sites. And we can add language to clarify that if we need to the code. We can discuss that further tonight. So one thing that the code now states is that the setback requirements need to meet the underlying zone, and that they also need to be 200 feet from residential development. So if it went on a commercial site, language proposes that it's 200 feet from residential development that's nearby or future residential development. And the reason for that is the Planning Commission had concerns and recommended a fall zone criteria in the code. So that's the reason behind that addition. Another thing that you're seeing that wasn't in the earlier draft is that there is now a spacing requirement of 1,000 feet, because if we do have a 100-foot pole, we don't want to see a whole field of 100-foot poles. And so the spacing requirement that's proposed is 1,000 feet. That's for most poles. There is a scenario in there that if it's near the transmission power lines, that they don't need to be spaced that far apart from each other because they tend to blend in with the transmission lines. And then there's also an added requirement for architecture. Specific to the AT&T site was a concrete box, and there were some expectations with that we were addressing. And so what this does is it requires that they be masonry buildings with a pitched roof so that they're a little bit better looking. One thing that you'll notice in the next item on the agenda is that these changes don't allow for that particular site that was being discussed. And so I think that's an important thing to take into consideration. And then the other changes in the code are related to public utility sites and now also public building sites. We didn't have public buildings in there in the last draft, and that has been added. And then there is specific language about chain link fences. That's a big topic. And I have more some of these. And then language was added to exempt the public utility sites from the architectural requirements. Right now, our architectural requirements for structures in general in the city require 2 colors and 2 materials and a certain percent of glazing glass, a certain percentage of glass. And there's some other things in there, but for these small utility buildings, we didn't necessarily want them to go to that extent with their architecture. So let me go to, here's a list of, here's a more specific list. So I have a slide like this for the cell towers, and then another slide like this for the public utility sites and public building sites. So in regard to cell towers, there's some language highlighted relating to camouflaging, and then I also have some slides of some examples of, and the reason for bringing it up again is to get further direction on, right now the code requires camouflaging in certain instances. However, what I'm finding on the web is that the camouflaging can make it stand out more rather than make it disappear. And,
Like a
and
palm
so,
tree
so I
and-
put that in here for further discussion by the Planning Commission if you want to amend that section related to camouflaging, or if you wanted to remove that section or even add to it. And then height, I covered the height, that it's related by property size now, not by zone. And then location is, there's separate criteria for non-residential sites versus residential lots. So in non-residential areas, it could be allowed on 1 acre or greater, and then the height would depend on the property size according to the residential areas. It would be allowed at schools or parks that are 5 acres or greater in size, and that would be 100 feet that would be allowed. On public building or public utility sites of 1 to 5 acres, up to 80 feet would be allowed, and on 5 acres or larger, up to 100 feet would be allowed. This would address some of the concerns we've been hearing from the cell tower companies about locations in the south and how to address the service needs there. This would allow for a cell tower at a school, at our fire station or a public works site, or at some of our pond sites. And then they would also be allowed adjacent to transmission power line corridors, and the height would also depend on the size of the property. For setbacks, as I mentioned, they would need 200 feet from existing and future residential development. And then the spacing, 1,000 feet apart. One thing we added in here that you didn't see last time is related to the antenna and how far out they can be from the pole. And so the draft states that they need to be 4 feet maximum from the pole, or if there's a shield around them, that they could be 6 feet maximum from the pole. And then, as I mentioned, the architecture with the masonry building and the pitch roof. Right now, I caught this today. We didn't mention fencing under the cell tower section. So I would imagine we want to include the no chain link there. Although it is in our code in general, so I mean, chain link's not allowed by our code in general, except we're considering allowing it for public building sites and public utility facilities in some instances. And so here are some examples of stealth design. Our city right now on the left-hand side of the page, and then on the right-hand side of the page is just an example of camouflaging that I found on the web, where they made it look like a tree. However, it's so far above the other trees that it's not blending in. And then we have another 100-foot pole that's already existing in our city. As you're heading north on Redwood Road at about 2300 north, there's a pole there. However, some of the other camouflage options in this, the question is, does the camouflage options that are available or that we're seeing, do they make them more noticeable, or do they help them blend in and be more stealthy? Here's some examples. So there's a silo in Lehigh that you can see from Pioneer Crossing and Mill Pond Road, and then here's 2 other examples I found on the web, just of examples of tall towers. It's a screenshot of a whole bunch of things that came up. So a tall cactus, a tall flag, a tall water tower, a crazy bird head. And then here's some other examples. But then with the tall flagpole, you're not getting all of the antenna around it. So I'm not sure how they're addressing it in that particular situation. This right here, you saw this at the last presentation. It's a propagation map that Sprint prepared. And I only have Sprint in here just because they've been communicating with us, not because, you know, we like Sprint or anything like that, or have a preference for them or anything. But what they prepared here, this is more of the south end of the city, and they are showing 2 examples of a map, and they're considering school sites. And the map on the pole and the map on the right has a 100-foot pole, and they're just trying to give us a visual indication of the difference between the pole heights. And then obviously you know, the different heights between those end up in different results as well. This is a map that AT&T provided, and they're having issues with congestion, meaning there's so many users that calls are dropping. And so they're trying to address the congestion issues in the north part of our city. This was presented by this message right here was given by the Sprint representative at our and was presented at our last meeting. So there were several questions asked. Okay, some of the questions were, if the poles aren't 100, reply was, well, that means more poles to reach, you know, to get the same result. So if they're shorter, you're going to see more of them. So that's one question to consider is, do we prefer tall poles and fewer of them, or shorter poles and more of them? And then, so their message indicates that to receive the equivalent coverage that they would get with a 100-foot pole, that they would need 3 or 4 sites that are 35 feet, which is what the current zone allows, the current existing code without the draft changes allows. They said a site under 40 feet is typically reserved for mini cells, that they don't usually do a tower at that height. And then, let's see here. So I have a work session with the 2 cell tower representatives that were here. I did meet with them and receive their feedback, and that was also considered in the draft as well, of course keeping the city's needs in mind as that was all being drafted, and the comments from the Planning Commission. However, I believe what's proposed would allow the cell companies adequate coverage in the city, because there's enough sites in residential areas that are 5 acres or larger that could possibly have a tall tower to address those coverage needs. Okay, so as far as public building and public utility buildings and facilities, it's written in there that they would not be required to meet the size, width, frontage, coverage, and building size. One example is that we have a filter station in our city, and the building itself is only about 10 feet by 10 feet. It's a pretty small building, and that particular piece of property that it needs to be on is about like a 1/10 of an acre. And so we have numerous sites in the city with filter stations or pump houses or lift stations that don't need to be very large. And so that's one reason, is that they could go in these zones. They would still have to come through a site plan review process and a conditional use process, so people would still get notified and it would still be reviewed through the public process, but it would allow those exemptions to allow more flexibility with those sites. And then for setbacks, there are a handful of options in there depending on the particular size, whether it's below grade or above grade. And then there's also a statement in there that greater setbacks could be required through the conditional use process. One thing the conditional use process allows to happen is that we can add additional criteria to mitigate impacts to health, safety, or welfare of the general public. So if there was a particular site that for some reason seemed it would have an impact on surrounding development, we could look at greater setbacks. So what's proposed is that unoccupied buildings, so buildings that people aren't working at, that they might just come to service the facility or things like that, that nobody needs to be in the building on a regular basis. If they're 200 square feet or less, or 15 feet or less, that they would not have any, that they wouldn't be able to cover the public utility easement. And that's generally 5 to 10 feet. And then larger buildings, so buildings larger than the 200 square feet or taller than the 15 feet, and buildings that are occupied on a, you know, like have people working there on a regular basis, those would have to meet the setbacks of the underlying zone. So all other buildings and structures like a pond or a water tank, and buildings below grade, they would just have to be outside of the public utility easement. So there wouldn't be a specific setback except for the 5 to 10 feet for the public utility easement. Fencing, so fencing was a big topic. Right now our code doesn't allow chain link fencing. That the city is currently proposing to add capacity to our secondary water, and that's going to service more of the northern part of the city. And one thing that's proposed around that site is a perimeter fence, and our code doesn't allow chain link. So in the past, the city has funded a wrought iron style fence. It's aluminum, but it looks like a wrought iron, and the cost difference between the two is about $150,000. And so because of the cost difference, we wanted to, and that's bringing to light the conversation, in what situations do we want to allow chain link fencing around the public utility sites. At the last meeting, we got feedback that we may not want it right up next to a street, or we may not want chain link right up next to residential. And so what you're seeing here is a proposal residential development or zoning. And as I put this together, I realized the word zoning might conflict with itself because a lot of these ponds are in residential zones. So I think we need to strike the word zoning and say existing residential development. And then 100 feet from a street. And in the draft it says right of way, but a lot of times just an easement can be a right of way. So I propose changing that from right of way to street. And then barbed wire would only be allowed if there's a legitimate safety concern related to the public health, safety, or welfare. And then for other sites where we don't necessarily need chain link or barbed wire, the fencing could be determined by the property owner and subject to final approval through the site plan review process, which the city count on that. And then the other types of fences that are listed as options would be masonry, wrought iron style, steel reinforced pre-panelized polyethylene, which is Simtech, but we didn't want to use a specific brand. And then the height limit would be 8 foot maximum. For landscaping, it's suggested that all park strips have landscaping, you know, so that if you have even if it's an unmanned site, that you have sort of a xeriscape look, maybe rocks and trees, and that they meet the park strip landscaping requirements. And if the site is not landscaped, that weed prevention is required. And also we do have some of these sites that even though it may be a water tank or a water pond, it might not have water available because that is going to other areas. So the pond there that we can, you know, irrigate right off of that pond because the pond is going downhill and then going back uphill to serve other areas, or things like that. So it's proposed that that landscaping only be required where there are water services available. For site and architectural design, it's proposed that this does not that the section of code, as I mentioned earlier, with the architecture requirements, that it doesn't apply, except for the building, same thing like the cell towers, that the buildings be constructed of masonry and have a pitched roof. And so far all of the city's buildings have met that criteria. One thing we would like to add to the code, we have so in the wintertime we have to salt our roads, and we have a pile of salt work site, and that needs to be covered to meet specifically mandated requirements. We have a certain amount of time we need to come into compliance and cover our salt storage. And so the city is proposing a temporary or portable structure to cover that salt storage. And right now that wouldn't meet our architectural design standards in the code. And so what we're proposing is that portable or temporary structures are only allowed by municipalities and do not have to meet the design standards. And I'll sit down and let you.
Thank you, Sarah. Given that there are considerable changes to what was published in the previous meeting, and we did close public comment in the last meeting, I would, what are your thoughts opening this up to public comment?
I think there's a lot of changes,
I think there are too.
right, to get public back.
Agreed. Okay. So we're going to open up public comment for item number 5. This is legislative recommendation for proposed code amendments to Title 19. Just to give you a little clarification, the decision before us tonight is legislative. That means that we have a lot of leeway. We have the ability to make decisions based not only in the code, but based upon what the public has to say. So we'd love to hear what you have to say. If you could keep your comments down to about 3 minutes, state your name and address for the record, and time is yours.
My name is Ken Evans. I reside at 480 West, 1530 North in Saratoga Springs.
Welcome back,
First,
Ken.
I would like to commend the Planning Commission and Planning Department for the level of review and discussion they've given to the Title 19 proposed code amendments and additions. Proposed code amendments and additions for wireless telecommunications equipment at Section 1905.03 have been significantly improved since they were initially presented and since I sent a copy of a memorandum that I prepared to Planning Commission members. They have incorporated comments made at public hearings along with recommendations made by planning commissioners. The proposed code still needs sextant, statement, definitions, and findings and analysis, as I noted in the memorandum that I sent you. These sections are standard in municipal codes found in Utah and across the country. And even with all the changes that have been made, I would still suggest that the Planning Commission, you as Planning Commissioners, review the observations section of the memorandum that I prepared with the City Attorney. In the City Council work session held on June 20th, 2017, the minutes state, while addressing the issue of locating cell towers on city-owned property, quote, the Assistant City Manager noted benefits to the city included additional revenue. The city has the ability to regulate locations, zones, and other factors, and encourage co-location of equipment to reduce the number of cell towers. However, these can additionally be regulated by code amendments. The minutes continue. Council agreed it should be required that towers be located on city property infrastructure unless otherwise demonstrated. Co-location, height, camouflage, smallest footprint, and reasonable site barrier determined by code, zone, and topography. Discussed possible creation of a new unique civic zone. This is a very good purpose intent statement. It's consistent with most of our surrounding communities, and it includes sound analysis. I suggest that it should be one of the driving factors in this code section, and I recommend that it be added to the proposed code section changes for 19.0503. City Council's decision to require city-owned property, as they are in Lehigh, Highland, and cities across the country, makes existing and proposed code for city-owned properties relevant for wireless telecommunications equipment that will be located on city-owned property. Newly proposed code titled Public Utility Building or Facility and Public Building Sites at Section 1915.05.067. I'm going to give you a copy of this stuff because it's got a lot of code references, and I'm a CPA, and I guess I spend too much time dealing with code. Addresses some of these issues, which Sarah Carroll just went over. So do the definitions found in 19.02. I have concerns about both and how they relate to the proposed wireless telecommunications equipment code that's being developed. Proposed definition 41 reads, building owned and operated or owned and intended to be operated by a public agency of the United States of America, state of Utah, or any of its subdivisions, including counties or municipalities, in connection with any public use. Definition 220 reads, public and private utility building or facility means a building, lot, or structure used or intended to be used by any public or private utility. The definitions and examples included in the definitions appear to include wireless telecommunication equipment. New code section at public utility building or facility and public building sites that was just reviewed states, or it did state, I believe it still does, minimum lot size, lot width, lot frontage, lot coverage, and building size requirements do not apply to public utility buildings or facilities and public sites that are owned by a government entity or public utility company in the state of Utah. Based on the proposed definitions and proposed code and the City Council's requirement that new cell towers be built on city-owned property, all the new and improved standards and ordinances it has developed for wireless telecommunication equipment could possibly only apply to cell towers that are not built on city-owned property. This could be remedied by addressing the wording in the above definitions and by excluding wireless telecommunication equipment from the new code section, public utility buildings or facility, and public building sites. City code should not exempt wireless telecommunication equipment from nearly all Title 19 standards and ordinances because they're located on city-owned property and are defined in ability, just because state law allows. The memorandum I sent to the Planning Commission contains references to professional analysis of several key issues that I believe the city should still consider. One article in particular analyzes why municipalities should be careful in their local ordinances to make sure that wireless facilities do not fall within their code's definition of public utility. Saratoga Springs seems to be going in the opposite direction with its code. Exemptions from certain Title 19 city code requirements should be allowed for public utility building and facilities located on small irregular parcels, as was just explained, like the one where the pump station at 400 West and Crossroads Boulevard is located. However, such exemptions should be limited, specifically designated, and subject, not lumped into an all-encompassing one-size-fits-all code section that could exempt even major facilities such as wireless communications equipment from Title 19 city code requirements. I recommend that the Planning Commission address these matters before it passes the remaining proposed code amendments. And I, again, thank you for your time, consideration, your very careful consideration of this matter, your attention to public input, in particular mine. And I have a copy of my comments. Each of you, if you would like to look at the code section of deliberations, if that would be.
Were those part of the email that we received? You can just pass them out to us. We'll take them. Just give them to or over here, and we'll pass them over.
No, we received it.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Evans. Are there others? And I would, if you're all here to comment on this item, let's just try to do our best not to repeat the same things that have been said. But if you do feel the same way about it, just tell us. I feel the same way about these things that have already been mentioned. Okay, thank you.
My name is Nathan Delahunty. I live at 1713 North Aspen Circle. And I showed up tonight because for two reasons. First, I wanted to really commend the body here, both the planning commission, in particular on the topic of the chain link fence, allowing certain utilities like reservoirs to be surrounded or enclosed by chain link fence when they don't encroach upon residential areas. And I think that solution is a great one, and one I'd like to see and see more of. And cost savings that it has for the city. Now, when I hear that number, 100%, right, and that's money that will be deployed back towards the great things. So I think the city the planning department and planning commission are intended for actions like that. Second was, I noted in the packet, as I read the packet for tonight's meeting, in particular code section 19.15.067A, proposed code recommends exemption of public utility buildings with facilities from the minimum lot size requirement, so on and so forth. Mr. Evans before me spoke about that. So my point here really is how is the interpretation of that can be had here over time when zoning requirements proposed property where public utility building would be placed that's owned by the city. My opinion would be the city would have to go through the rezoning requirements like anybody would place property, building, or tower, or otherwise property, so that the good for the property and the proof of those made the citizens in that area that may oppose that. The long-term solution would be to ensure that public utility buildings are not exempted when it's owned, or when the property is owned by the city. I think the one thing I would prescribed to have stricken from the proposed amendment would be just 19.15.06.7.8. That was all I had to say. Thanks, Dennis.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you.
I'll be up here.
Okay.
Hi, Ben Christensen, 415 West Aspen Hills Boulevard.
Gary Christensen.
Okay. First, I wanted to echo the comments of Nate and Ken. Appreciate their comments, and I agree with those. Just one additional thing, I'm not super familiar with cell phone tower technology or anything like that. It seems like height is a major factor for coverage. I know that there are some options around our area where there's some hills, such as the water tower located kind of north of Harvest Hills. I don't know if that would be a possible location for a cell tower. Seems like they could build a shorter tower but still have a greater overall height, because that hill is about 500 feet above the location where AT&T is proposing their tower right now. And then I don't fully understand the co-localization, multiple towers in the same spot, or if it was possible for multiple carriers to just use the same pole to try to reduce the amount of poles that need to be put in. If multiple carriers could just put their own antennas, that might be, I know they probably don't like to play nice with each other very much, but if that's something that would be possible for the city to encourage to reduce the number of poles that need to go in, I think that'd be a great step to take as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Christensen.
Alita Wilkinson, 1734 Parsley Court. I just want to agree.
Thank you very much.
Pardon me, the proposed code up here is different than the one I downloaded this morning. So if the commission would allow me to make sure that I'm targeting the right code section, I apologize for, I don't have to waste your time.
That's fine.
And yeah, the one I'm looking at here was different than this one. It's not to strike A, it would be to strike B, which is the second one. That's the one that would exempt public, pardon me, the buildings from, my wording right here, sorry. B is the one that would strike, pardon me, that would allow the setbacks to be eliminated or exempted from property that's owned by the city. It's not A, it's B.
And
I'll
you're
just
let
clarify.
me clarify too that Nathan, you wanted to strike item B, posing. Okay.
Yes.
You're right.
In the packet and in your staff reports and everything online, it's A. Green is just what you're seeing, a proposed amendment based off of feedback I've seen since the packet was gone out, so I haven't just,
So for the
So
intents
keep
of this meeting, what you're asking or you're proposing is to strike the exemptions for the cell towers, or is it for all public utilities or just for the cell tower?
Yeah, public utilities.
All public
Not solid,
utilities,
but public utilities.
that they don't have to go through any kind of review process. I think that wasn't that 1916-02 that it said it was exempt from?
no, he wants them to have to meet lot size, lot width, lot frontage, lot coverage, building size requirements in the underlying zone.
Okay.
Or go through the rezoning process.
All right. I think we've clarified what you're looking
Saw the difference there and I was like, uh-oh, that's not what I
for. Okay. Thank you.
And what this is an exception to Title 19 for public buildings and public utility buildings as well. And so what Sarah has proposed doing is basically exempting cell phone or whatever we call them, the monopoles or freestanding towers, exempting that type of public utility building, because there are public utility companies that put in cell phone towers. Not every cell phone company is a public utility, but there are some that are.
If I could just give a little background on some of the lot size discussions I've had in the past dealing with cell phone natural gas companies. Instance I had in a previous place I worked, a regeneration, what they call it, station had, or booster pump had to be put in for the utility. And there's certain places based on the demand of that system where that has to go. There's a limited geographical region where that would have to go. So if the minimum lot size is required, some of these places could be 8, 9, 10,000 square foot, 8 or 9, 10,000 square foot lot that has to be used. Well, in reality, the facility that they need only occupied 1,500 square feet or 2,000 square feet. So I think it gives them the option to say, we don't need all that property just for this type of utility. It really is a waste of property in that sense. And so that gives them the option, because most of these utilities don't need a large lot to put their facility, to go smaller.
Okay, so now I'm confused. So I understood this to be an exemption for public utilities regarding setbacks, lot size, fencing, etc. But Kevin, what I understood from what you were saying is that this section exempts cell phone towers from the public utilities section, or did I get that wrong?
No, you're right. This subsection is an exception to those certain Title 19 requirements that are mentioned there. Now, the green language that's proposed by Sarah says basically for those monopole towers, freestanding towers, the cell phone towers that we've been discussing, if the public's proposing one of those, they don't qualify for this exception. They have to go back. They have to follow the regular process in Title 19.
So everything, every public utility except cell phone towers is what that's what's
exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
So let me clarify before we go back to public comment. As we were coming into the meeting tonight, what was proposed in the packet was that utilities have lesser restrictions upon them, okay? And then the concern was that would apply to the cell phone towers, the wireless communications. What this adds is that cell phone towers are not exempted from those lesser requirements. They still have the higher requirements. So anyway, back to the public.
I didn't pick up on that either because I was going based on the agenda packet information.
So were we.
But that A alone does not take care of the issues or resolve all of the issues in the notes that I just gave you, or my comments. There are several sections in definitions and other sections that are listed in there that refer to public utilities and definition, and also in your code, in our code, city code, refer to government-owned and limit the ability of restrictions by definition category. And so I think all of those each of those need to be looked at and clarified, because I believe there's conflict still there. I still think there is a loophole that can be walked through that is not completely resolved by that. And I'm not an attorney, but your city attorney, I'm sure, can figure that out.
Thank you, Ken. Did you want to comment on that,
I
Kevin?
mean, that's a policy discussion for the Planning Commission as far as their recommendation is concerned. Are you comfortable that this exemption applies to public utility companies? You've heard from members of the public here that are asking the Planning Commission not accept that recommendation, not to forward that recommendation to the council. That's a policy decision. If you want this exemption from the certain Title 19 only to public entities and not public utility companies, you certainly can make that recommendation. I think that there's very good reasons to allow these exemptions to apply to public utility companies as well. At the end of the day, that's what they're going to do, is they're going to pass along those costs to the customer. It's the same thing as a public entity. At the end of the day, we're all going to be paying more for our public utilities if these requirements apply. So that's really a policy consideration.
Just for the record, the time is still yours. We have a lot of opinions up here that we're just holding back and waiting to say. So go ahead. If you have any other comments for the public, now's your time. I've read the packet and we're ready to go. So.
Yeah, Ben again. If I understood Nate correctly, I think that the idea is to not blanket reject the idea that public utilities could go through these exemptions, but not allow that kind of rotely, that if they wanted to qualify for these exemptions, that they would have to apply for that exemption, so that there could be a kind of a public hearing opportunity for that. Did I get that right?
Thank you. And for the record, what was your name? I'm just doing that for the record. Ben Christensen is what it was.
Darren Delahunty. I live at 443. First of all, I want to thank you for your service here as well as the department. I think we're in a better spot tonight than two meetings ago. But I did want to just let you know I do agree with the comments that have been brought forth by and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Delahunty. Do we have any other public comments?
I'm Bruce Termelin. I live at 491 West. I'd just like to say that I agree. Very careful. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Bruce. Anyone else? Okay, we'll close public comment for item number 5, and we'll open this up to the Planning Commission.
And so, can I take a minute?
Yes.
Okay. There were a couple of comments that I heard. So one of the comments was that we
That's
want
right.
to.
I'm sorry. We didn't respond to any of your comments. We're going to do that now.
Okay.
My apologies.
One of the comments that I actually got feedback on earlier today from Commissioner Chapman was that we want to make sure that the language is written so that wireless telecommunication equipment doesn't fall under the public utility and public building site section. So what you're seeing here in green is intended to address that, which states this section does not apply to wireless telecommunication commitment, which is regulated by Chapter 1905. So that was the intent of adding what you're seeing in green. And then the other item that you see in green here says, and this is related to fencing around public utility sites or public building sites, such as Public Works or the fire station or future City Hall, or in this particular case would more be around water tanks and ponds and things like that. And so it says vinyl coated chain 200 feet from existing residential development or zoning. However, the pond that we're putting in the upcoming future at the very top of Evans Lane is so Evans Lane is west of Saratoga. Wait, what's Sage Hills, or what's the elementary school right off of Foothill? Thunder Ridge. Okay, so Evans Lane is west of Thunder Ridge. So kind of up the hill from Thunder Ridge, we're putting in a secondary water pond. And so around that pond, the cost difference I mentioned earlier was related to chain link versus aluminum wrought iron style fencing. And so what we have here though is it says 200 feet from existing residential development or zoning. However, it's zoned residential. So I think this or zoning is contradictory to what we're intending to do here. So I wanted to recommend striking that. So I'll strike it now, but if you...
Sure, we'll comment on it later.
Yeah, and the mouse is so finicky right now. Trying to get to
If we do strike it, then does that need to be mentioned in the motion as a?
Well, sometimes I make changes and then you approve what's been amended
What's
up
been
here,
changed.
so.
Okay. Okay.
So okay. And then Jason, you're within 100 feet of this said right of way, and I've changed that to street. So that was, and then I've got one other change. Let me make sure that was it for this section.
So just for the planning commission to understand this, the particular application we're thinking of would probably not allow chain link if that's adopted by the council eventually. And there's other public utility sites that have been required to do the wrought iron at extreme cost that are immediately adjacent to a right of way. So that's just something to consider. I think that the council is already, I think that they're already on board with that. Anything that's immediately adjacent to existing resident, the wrought iron fence or the masonry walls, whatever. But I think that makes a lot of sense. But you might want to discuss that specific thing as far as the 100-foot requirement to streets.
Okay, let's make sure that we've addressed everybody's.
So sure. In 1905, there's two changes in here that you're seeing in green that aren't included in the packet. So one was that where there's a section allowing antenna on top of existing light poles, either at sports fields or in the right of way. And one clarification is that when they replace that pole with a stronger pole to carry the weight of their antenna, that the fixtures have to be placed at the original height, so that they can't be higher. Just to clarify that. And then the other thing that came up when we drafted this, we drafted lattice towers are prohibited, but then it's been pointed out by Commissioner Steele that there's a lattice tower that UDOT uses to gather weather information, and that's not a very tall tower. It's not taller than the street light intersection, the intersection street light next to it. So I put in lattice towers greater than 35 feet are prohibited is what I added to address that, so that we can still have those for things like weather stations up to a certain height, but we don't want enormous lattice.
Okay, so let's try to address some of these other questions. So Ken Evans said that was A. It would not fix all of the items that he had addressed in his letter.
A 1.5-page single-space letter, it would take me a minute to read through that to be able to comment on that. I did discuss this with the attorney Kevin earlier today and asked him if we added this language to distinguish that wireless telecommunication equipment is regulated by the other chapter and not this one, if that would work. And he said that's something that we can do. And also, if you have two regulations that conflict, the more restrictive regulation applies. So even if this section conflicts with that, the other section is more restrictive, so that would still apply.
Actually, what it is when you have two conflicting sections of the code, it's not the more or less restrictive provision necessarily. It's the more specific provision. So because the more specific provision is the cell phone tower section, that would apply and take precedence over this less specific section, if that makes sense. Because we've specifically addressed the situation of cell phone towers, and we did not create this exemption under that subsection. That said, it's always better not to allow that argument to be made, and so that makes perfect sense. You don't want to exempt the public utility companies from the cell tower requirements that are under consideration today. And also keep in mind the public has public utility companies from Title 19 requirements and would rather them go through some sort of formal approval process where there's a public comment. Public comment is allowed. That's another thing you could consider is requiring a rezone in cases like that, although planning has some concerns about that.
So
If I might just say, I think my understanding of Mr. Evans' concern regarding this specifically was that with wireless communication equipment being qualified or defined as a public utility, this isn't the only place in the amended code to where there were some exceptions given to public utilities that he was unaware or uncomfortable with. You could just give me a shake of your head if I'm getting you. More his concern was we would need something like this in every section where we're giving public utilities special treatment. And maybe that's something you can speak to.
But don't we, so public utilities are allowed in all zones, but they are still conditional use, which means they always have to come up before, right? Yeah, because they're conditional use, and because they're and as a conditional use, we are allowed to add restrictions or exemptions based on health, welfare, safety, and all that anyway. Is that correct?
Right.
So okay, so the process itself already takes care of that.
So conditional uses are much more nuanced than that. The state law actually says that we have to have applicable standards that apply when you're imposing those conditions, and they have to address detrimental stuff, health, safety, and welfare. That's very general. That's typically the standard for legislative decisions. Health, safety, and welfare, you can pass any law that you believe promotes the general welfare. Conditional uses are not that way. You have to have an actual standard in Title 19 that says for conditional use, if you're addressing detrimental impacts, these are the conditions in that situation. So it's an administrative decision, and if the code doesn't have those applicable standards, you can't impose those restrictions, if that makes sense. And then we just have to make sure we go through the conditional use section and be able to have that tie-in condition. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. We always skip that last step of the state code that says the conditions have to be in accordance with applicable standards.
So the last time we were here, we did discuss this, and we discussed splitting off the different utilities and their uses. Would code that is specific to each use assist us in making that decision, like you were saying, against detrimental uses?
May I speak?
Sorry, I still haven't finished addressing.
Well, let's finish this one and we'll go back to you.
I do definitely, I want, want to hear all the discussion, but I don't know if I should finish addressing those before we. Okay, so one of the comments I heard was, what about the tank above Harvest Hills? The way this is drafted is they could have up to, that site is not 1 acre. It's a 0.8 acre site. And so they could have the height allowed by the underlying zone, which would be at 35 feet. So at that particular site, it could be allowed at 35 feet. One question that was asked was, what is co-location? So that is when other users go on the same pole. So the same pole could have up to 4 antennae, but they could all be different providers. One question is, can the city encourage co-location? And our code does that. Our code already states that they have to look into co-location prior to putting up a new tower. Another comment that was made is, rather than having this language about minimum lot size, width, frontage, coverage, and building size that you're seeing up here, that these requirements do not apply to public building or facility sites. And keep in mind, this does say not intended for occupancy. So these are generally smaller buildings. Of course, they won't always be, but they're generally the smaller buildings are exempt from those, and the buildings that are going to be occupied are not exempt from those. It does state that, and I do want to, we have had discussions about why don't we rezone these. There are several reasons and examples why we've been leaning against rezoning each of these. If we rezone each of these to a public utility zone, we would still have this language. We would still recommend and suggest this language. And the reason we would do so, the reason we're doing so now, that if we have, a 100 square foot filter station that is on a 0.06 acre site, that we can still do that. So The rezone doesn't change. So a conditional use permit still has to go through a process very similar to the rezone process. There's a public notice required. There's one step that's different, is that it doesn't get a public notice for both Planning Commission and City Council, where a conditional use permit gets a public notice for Planning Commission. So there's one step that's different, but it's still a public process, and it still allows for public input. And then by handling it this way, rather than rezoning each site, we're not creating little dots of a different zone all over the city utility site is proposed. And also, all of these are for public services. And so you're going to see them in residential neighborhoods. You're going to see them in probably all of the different zones out there. And then what we would be doing by having a public utility zone would be adding this, you know, a little specific site with a different zone in all these different other zones throughout the city.
Sarah, also, didn't the Sprint guy last meeting say something about they did do an analysis of putting poles on hills, and it just so happens that because of Saratoga Springs geography and being next to the lake, that if the pole size isn't just perfect or whatever, it would bounce off the lake, the signals would, and so that wasn't considered a great solution for our particular location. I think that...
I don't know how that would apply above the Harvest Hills area, but the Sprint representative was looking at two sites that would be more direct in line with the lake or more parallel to the lake. So I don't know if it would have the same impact if it was above Harvest Hills, but he did make that comment that the refraction from the lake makes a difference on the functionality of the cell tower.
Just, I believe the comment from the individual that's here tonight was, why don't we look at you know, locating it on water towers or water tanks, because of, I guess, it being less obtrusive, I guess. It helps lessen the impact. It wasn't above Harvest Hills. It was just try to put it on some places where it's going to be less noticeable, because there's already a noticeable water tank there. So that, I mean, that certainly is, that's something you can consider on. I mean, another option is you can make it mandatory. A lot of the cell phone companies are putting them on light poles and things like that, traffic signal poles, and that's, a lot of them are going that direction because of it's much cheaper than having this freestanding pole. So you can make that more of a mandatory requirement also.
Sarah, I just wanted to make sure that you've finished.
I addressed all the notes I had.
Okay, I've looked at all my notes, and I think you did a really good job that were asked. So at this time, we'll open it up to the Planning Commission.
Mayor,
Yes.
I just had wanted to address Mr. Evans' comment, and if we look at 220 and the definitions section, as public and private utility buildings and facilities, we did not take out the telephone switching and communications plant, earth station, or other receiving or transmission facility. And that it probably is the loophole that he's talking about that somebody might try to walk through. And so we may need to change that, even to exclude, put something in there excluding I'll save anything else.
Let's note that. Need to know 202. And you're proposing what? That we put in exclude, that it does not exclude?
That it does exclude.
It does exclude cell phone towers.
Monopole towers. Because telephone switching might be regular, whoever.
I think you referred to definition 41 and definition 40.
220. Yep, that's it.
Okay, other comments from the planning commission?
Well, if we're opening it up, I got some questions. So, help me understand this. We're handling a lot of the lot size requirements and setbacks and stuff like that for cell phone towers specifically in the cell phone towers section where we're talking about acreage required and setbacks, which are normal setbacks plus 200 feet and stuff like that. So how would any of these exempting them from lot size requirements and stuff like that have any impact on them where we're already making some very specific rules as to when and setbacks based upon the lot size that they're going on? What am I missing here?
Are you
It's
talking
a public
specifically?
a public utility building rather than the cell tower that's, they're talking about exempting from the lot sizes.
And if they're under an acre, then they fall under the residential or under that land zone if they're under an acre, but that would exempt them from doing that.
So you could have a lift station that doesn't take up a whole lot of land. It
No,
doesn't.
I understand that. I'm just talking about, so specifically with the cell phone tower stuff. So we've got a cell phone tower that wants to go into a residential area, 35 feet. And so by doing this, they would then have to be on, if we were to take away that exception and it was a 10,000 foot lot requirement in that area, they would then have to be on a 10,000 foot lot, even if they've only got a 2,000 square foot building with a 35 foot.
Clear that that's the case.
200 foot.
For a 100-foot tower. But it was 5 acres for a 100-foot.
Right.
Right.
But didn't it say 200 feet?
It doesn't.
200 feet, does it say
200 feet. It didn't
any tower height?
differentiate between tower height.
Right.
So.
Would you like for me to explain the 200 feet?
No, I
I
understand.
don't think that's what you're asking.
Yeah, no, so it sounds like minimum, regardless of zone, that a cell phone, if you're putting up a cell phone tower, you have to have a 200-foot setback from any existing residential property, plus the normal setback for that zone. So if you're in a residential area in the front.
Right, and if you're in a commercial zone, you have to meet the front setback, plus you need to be.
But not for schools.
Okay, so it doesn't seem like this is going to be.
Schools too?
Well, if there's one on a school site, it also needs to be. So the 200 feet from residential is across the board.
Yeah, because remember last time we talked about how schools could do whatever they want, but I think it was Kevin or someone who explained that as long as it pertains to academics or schools, if it has to do with selling or leasing or whatever to a private company or a utility, then they fall under our rules.
Right. So we're interpreting it that the cell towers at schools have to comply with standard zoning. When located in a residential zone or on a non-residential zone that is adjacent to residential zones, development, or property designated for residential land use by the general plan, monopoles shall be a minimum of 200 feet from the property line abutting residential uses.
And that was put in, you said, because of the concern about falling.
Right.
So that seems a little, maybe like a little bit overkill for like a 35-foot tower.
No, that's the reason I was going to explain it. I did some research and found that the public in certain areas were complaining because many times the work that's done on cell towers is done at night, and they bring in lights and equipment, generators and whatnot, and the noise, if you're right on it, is obnoxious. And so in other cities that I looked at, the 200 feet was more or less normal.
Actually, it was more like 1,000 feet, wasn't it? I think on Mr. Evans' report, just between Lehigh and Highland, I think they require 1,000 feet. So we're actually way under. So maybe all other cities combined, maybe it's around 200 or so, but yeah, it's not considering what other cities do, it's not considered overkill.
And then so another question
We
we had.
don't, just to address your comment, Commissioner Still, we actually don't allow any sort of construction activities between the hours of 10 p.m. and 7 a.m.
Not
under any
construction. This is
section.
this is repair, just like you don't tell the power company they can't repair their lines and those hours. Those are
Yeah, we'd have to look. We have a nuisance section that would address noise issues related to that. That would be separate from. I do see your point, though. It's more just the incompatible use adjacent residential uses, and that's what you should consider. Is 200 feet enough because of that incompatible use?
Okay, you had some comments?
I had one additional question. And Sarah, you did say that you sat down with the Sprint and AT&T representatives, and they were, in looking through this, they were comfortable that there was still enough property and opportunity here within the city to make sure that we're getting the coverage that we need, even with the current restraint.
Them and discussed some of the concerns and questions they had, and then that was taken into consideration when this was drafted, and then this has also been sent to them.
Okay. My one concern is I just want to make sure that while we're trying to protect the public, that we don't protect ourselves right out of ever having cell phone coverage out here in the city. That would, I think that would take us in the opposite direction of where we're wanting to go.
Just a couple of comments. I haven't been on the commission long, but all the issues we've had, I think this staff should be commended for the tremendous job in responding to both commission comments and public comments in drafting this language. And it shifted and it's kind of evolved quite heavily, but it's I think it's work. I certainly appreciate the flexibility to put towers on schools and public work buildings and the fire department and power poles. The 200-foot residential requirement, I think is a good thing. The fencing I think is great. The question I have, and it may be with setbacks, and it goes back to the section 7, for buildings intended for occupancy, it has to comply with the setback requirements of underlying zones. And I certainly want to be sensitive to public funds being used to purchase property where it may be a small building property to be able to accomplish that. My question is that it seems that they have to comply with a side setback and rear setback, but not a front setback. And I wanted to ask staff to explain that a little bit. I think this is in C7C.
Might be up on the screen.
Maybe I was just misreading it, but clarification might be helpful. I saw the side and I saw the rear in feet.
Oh. Well, so what it's doing is it's stating that they have to comply with the front setback in the underlying zone, but for the side.
And is that specific to buildings intended for occupancy, or both front underlying zone?
It's
not
for
intended for occupancy.
It's for large. It's for buildings above 200 square feet or taller than 15.
So there's nothing that says if you're doing a smaller facility not intended for occupancy that you could put that right at the front of the property line? Is that what the code's allowing?
Yeah, well, so it's saying that smaller buildings don't have to meet the setbacks, except for that they can't be covering the public utility easement, and that buildings 200 square feet or 15 feet in height have to meet the front setback, but that they can have a side setback of 10 feet.
So
and a rear setback of 10 feet. Zone, our R110 zone, the rear setback would be 25 feet. This would allow it to be closer to the rear than the underlying zone would.
But there's no front setback that's required for a building that's not intended for occupancy.
If it's smaller than 200 square feet.
So, just a consideration for the commission, probably go either way, but if we're striking a lot requirement or if we're allowing a no minimum lot size, width, frontage, coverage, building size, etc., then I think a way to balance that and still try and preserve fiscal responsibility with not having to buy huge lot size is to mandate setbacks on all sides rather than just the size. Adding my opinion that whether it's intended for occupancy or not, they would have to meet some sort of setback requirement.
Well, what's the reason why we require the side and back but not the front? Is it because the fence might be right on the opening of the building, or, I mean, is there a reason for that?
Yeah, for the larger building, so for the above so the reason we picked 200 square feet is, that's typically, well, okay, so if 200 square feet is about the size of a small 2-car garage. No, wait, sorry, a small 1-car garage, right? So 10 by 20, a small 1-car garage. That would be a small 1-car garage. That would be the size of a shed in your yard or things like that. The thing is that the typical public utility easement along the street is 10 feet. What we're saying is a small shed-type building that maybe had a filter station or a pump house would be 10 feet back from the street. But if it's bigger than 200 square feet, if it's bigger than, 10 by 20 or whatever, that it needs to meet the front setback so that it's not, as you're driving down the street, you don't all of a sudden see this big building right up by the, 10 feet from the sidewalk.
We've already factored in the easement.
Or 20 foot, right.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think with that clarification, I think this code is a great improvement. I was willing to pass this on today, understanding that improvements could still be made. I think staff should look at the memo from Mr. Evans and identify areas where it could be strengthened and to commission. I don't want to throw that away, but once again, I think staff did a tremendous job in balancing all the different comments and feedback to.
So I have just a couple typos and a couple questions. The page. Page 9 in the staff packet. It's
in the whole packet?
Yeah, it's page 9 in the whole packet, and it's number 5. Paragraph number 5. It says, yeah, the paragraph that says adding and limiting the outward distance, but the antenna should be and, I think.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, small.
Make sure I've got it up and make sure. Oh, is it in the staff report? Okay.
Get that?
That's not in the code.
Got it? Okay, and then the next one. Section, it's II. Location minimum lot size, this is paragraph I. So so the main section is freestanding antennae or towers. Then on the next page it's paragraph I. For location minimum lot size. Okay, and then subsection 1, residential zones, subsection, and then subparagraph D. You have it says it's just 120, it should be 120 feet. All type.
We wanted to make that cubits, actually.
Okay.
So we don't, even the
That's been added.
Got that? Yeah, that's okay. And then the very next page under NII says in the last part of that sentence, it says masonry and include and. See that? Okay. And then right above there in K, we're talking about spacing, and this is more of a discussion thing. Okay, so last couple weeks, my family and I took a road trip down the Pacific coast and have a lot of rural areas as well as city areas. And what we've noticed was when poles like these monopoles are clustered, it's actually better looking. So that's another, I mean, it seems like it's kind of settled, but I just want to throw in that sometimes poles, kind of like the idea about the transmission lines. When you have transmission lines already, and then you put the transmission, you know, whatever, the poles, and then you put more poles there, it kind of blends in. And so in the same way, a lot of rural areas, they clustered wide open spaces with no poles, and then you just had this cluster. So that's another way of looking at this. So I'm not sure that it's not necessarily the case that by spacing out these huge poles every 1,000 feet or whatever, is actually looks better. You know, so that actually just kind of muddies the water a little bit, but at least that was something that I noticed. So it's up for discussion. And then lastly, you asked about camouflaging. I think maybe there's a misunderstanding in what the word means. I don't think camouflaging necessarily means trees. I think it's you know, maybe if that is what most people think, then maybe we should use the word blending or whatever. So camouflage just means that the item looks like its surroundings, its background. So if there are no trees in the area and it's just blue sky or whatever, then painting it blue. You know, I mean that's what the word camouflaging should mean. I'm not saying, but that's basically what it means. It doesn't mean it has to look like a tree. So I think most people think that the Army thing, that Army has camouflage and it tends to look jungle, but that's not true. I mean, they have sand-colored ones. They have the Navy is blue. You know, the Navy has blue camouflage. So I think that's the idea. Is if you're asking about that comment, then either leave it camouflage because that's what it's supposed to mean, that it blends in, or you could call it maybe blending, and that might be a little bit more specific.
And to that point, I believe Smiths did that with the light poles on the new Smith site. I believe they went with a champagne color, and I don't know about you, but I actually haven't really paid any attention to those lights. They kind of have done what Boyer suggested and Smith suggested, which is they kind of disappear. So to your point, I think that's a good example of that.
Well, then one other thing is, years ago, I remember a discussion about what would be our symbol. You know, so right now we have that crane, whatever, we tend to use that. But there was a time when people were talking about a lighthouse. So I mean, there was even some discussion of building a lighthouse on the lake, you know, as an emblem of Saratoga Springs. So maybe one idea is if we're going to ever require a particular pole to be camouflaged, that one idea would be making it a lighthouse for Saratoga Springs.
So right now that section says for camouflage, where buildings or trees or large objects are present, all new monopole and freestanding structures shall use stealth design, meaning camouflage to blend in with said buildings. But then it also requires it in parks regardless of whether or not there are buildings or trees or large objects present. So that might be, you know, this other paragraph adding that it is required that camouflage or blending, if we want to call it that, is required in a park.
Well, okay, so one
of
other.
Change this word to blending.
But you did. I think we made a recommendation, for example, that if we are going to paint this cell tower, this AT&T cell tower, that it be black. And see, black is not camouflage; it's not blending. But the reason why I thought black wouldn't be a bad idea is because if you really look out right around Crossroads in that area, all the city lights are black, and so to have another black structure actually tends to blend in even more. So I don't know if we have to be that specific, because there are times where we might say, I know everything, sky blue would be best for camouflage, but black would be best for blending in with what's already there. You know what I mean?
Put in there, blending may include the painting or painting, because I'm afraid if we don't say that, then some of the cell phone people might not understand that they can do different kinds of blending, not just what we normally think of as camouflage.
It does make it hard. We don't want to write subjective criteria either. Okay, let's discuss it more.
Could you put like something, you've got some trees, used
Do we know?
I'm not opposed to what the code actually says right now, or what you have up there. I was just saying that you opened up, you requested some comments about the word camouflage, so I just gave you some comments about the word camouflage. I think the way you wrote it is fine, actually.
Well, and Sarah, I'm guessing there's like industry definitions as far as what camouflage is, and does that include painting and stuff like that? To where if we're kind of happy with the industry terminology of that, then using camouflage here as an industry standard term would be sufficient.
And can we make sure it excludes that glasses and nose with the mustache that's in there?
What do you mean? I like that one. That was.
Is there a way we could put the onus on the applicant of something like this, where they would have to recommend something to do this, to either blend in with light, fixscape, or whatever it may be, that the onus is on them to, and the requirement is simply that attempts need to be made to blend it in, and then it has to go to review of, I don't know if the design committee reviews these things, or who would review that blending or camouflage attempt?
Okay. But if you leave it to so like AT&T, they recommended stainless steel. But do they even? You know, if
That's
you
not
leave it
much
up,
of an
if you,
attempt.
no, that's what I mean. But if you leave it to the vendor, what does an attempt mean?
Well, it's cost possible.
Could you put some examples in there? Trees, towers, and paint to, something about paint or coloring.
Okay, but it says directly in there in section I, it says buildings, housing, cell tower equipment are exempt from chapter 19.16, which includes 19.1602, which is applicability and review process, which means there's no conformance review, there's no review of scaled elevation. So really that precludes the ability to review the color, the elevation, the look of this tower. So maybe we have to adjust that, because that's what it, okay, but it specifically says that, so maybe we should alter the code so it doesn't conflict. It's on one of the sections that says I. The wording is buildings, housing, cell tower equipment are exempt from chapter 19.16. Maybe that's just the building, not the tower.
We have site and architectural design listed. It's right above Ham Tower.
Maybe that was the section. That's the section where it says that buildings, housing, cell tower equipment shall be constructed of masonry, include anti-graffiti coating. So maybe it's specifically talking about the building and not the tower.
Site and architectural design, so right here.
Yep. See how it says it should be exempt from chapter 19.16?
Oh, 19.16 is the site and architectural design
Right.
section that requires 2 colors and 2 materials and
So if
glass
it's
and
exempt
stuff
from
like
that, it's
so
exempt.
in these criteria here for these facilities.
Okay. Got it.
I'd like to ask a question. Barbed wire is one thing, razor wire is another. Now, are we going to allow I can see the barbed wire. I would have a problem with razor wire.
Oh, okay.
But I think when it says barbed wire, that means barbed wire, not including.
The way it's now, it does not state anything about razor wire.
So it's just barbed wire. We might want to put a definition in, because I would hate to go out and see razor wire everywhere. Razor wire?
Yeah. You'll know.
Yes. Is that from experience?
Yes. The razor wire is much less forgiving.
I know.
We get everyone's comments on camouflaging. So
Sure.
that I have a general direction on if we want to strike that, change that, amend that, or maybe bring that back.
I'll weigh in because I haven't said anything. On the camouflaging, I'm not in favor of the trees. That's not camouflaging. That's like standing out more. The blending idea that Ken had, I think, is a good one. Maybe we could change the color somehow. I don't know which color we would use, but then on shorter towers, if they had to do something in a downtown, it looked good. And so did like, I think it was like a light sculpture. The other thing I've noticed when I've been walking around through parks and on my lunch hours when I go walk, until the last month or so, I didn't even know there were cell towers in these parks. And now I'm noticing there's cell towers in these parks. And they don't look like trees. They aren't painted. They just look like a nasty, ugly cell tower. And I didn't even notice them until I started to look. So I'm not sure, maybe we don't necessarily have to do anything. I think eventually, at first I'm sure a brand new one's gonna stand out, but after time, probably just disappear in the background.
So another thing too to consider, you know, if we are entering into a lease agreement, it's located on city property, we can specify those conditions. It's our property. We don't have to lease it to them unless they comply with our conditions. And so we could consider that on a case-by-case basis. The code doesn't have to address that.
I'll just weigh in since I haven't yet either. I had it written down as one thing to make sure we discussed, so I'm glad it did come up. But I don't have any big problem with your wording. And I kind of go along with some of the other comments. You know, I'm not real keen on the trees, and I think that if we make it to match the background or the things around it, whatever that may be, that might be more beneficial to whether we want to call it that or not.
So if we're trying to reduce camouflage section to an administrative decision where it gives guidance to whoever the applicant is, I would like to put in the code that it gives us enough flexibility that we can direct them one way or another, that it blends into the surroundings. I like that. If we don't put all of those provisions, Kevin, if we don't put all of the options in there, and I mean, you're saying that the conditional use permit doesn't have enough teeth? That
No, I'm just saying that if, for the camouflaging, it talks about it's required on city property or parks.
Yeah.
We can always address that in a lease agreement. It doesn't have to be addressed in the code.
Okay.
Then we can look at it on a case-by-case basis.
But it doesn't have to be.
But it would just be when, as we're drawing up the paperwork onto whether or not we're going to lease it to them, we say, we're going to put it here, we need X, Y, and Z.
All right.
We need it to look like Groucho Marx glasses with a mustache. That's what we can say.
Right. So I'd like to make sure that we're not allowing too many the trees that don't match the environment, but gives the city flexibility enough that it can blend into the environment, surroundings. You want to weigh in on that? The camouflaging. She wanted our.
I think I gave my comments. I'm actually okay with your wording. Yeah.
Any other comments on that?
I would prefer to just say, you know, they may use camouflaging and stealth design, but you know, as far as I say leave it open to handling it via lease agreement, and that way we can kind of do it. We don't have to worry about it from a code standpoint. The staff can just do it based upon what they feel is best in discussion with the cell phone company.
We provided enough feedback for you, Sarah.
Yeah, that is helpful. Right now, it's required that they camouflage in a city park, so we could strike that language, and then it could be, you know, the city could require that through other means.
Okay. All right. So were there other comments on this section? Because if not, I have a couple.
Strike this subsection right here that requires it to have camouflage in a city.
I think we're okay with that.
It does create an expectation when they come in. They can read it if we're negotiating it at that point. So, I mean, it could go either way. I get both arguments, but if it is clearly spelled out, then we're discussing it, we're not negotiating it.
My one concern is if it becomes required, then we might get a lot of cell phone towers that just the camouflage makes them stand out like a sore thumb because they were required to do it, and us trying to come up with verbiage that's going to account for every scenario and best, you know, options that they could do to camouflage it to make it actually blend in, I think that creates just a
But again,
world of problems.
that goes back to my original comment. Camouflage does not mean trees. So when you say that it stands out like a sore thumb, that's not camouflage.
No, I
So
understand.
if people are going to interpret the word camouflage in that way, thinking that it has to look like trees and it sticks out like a sore thumb, then we should change the. But if people understand the word camouflage to mean it does not stick out like a sore thumb, then they should say just the way Sarah.
Well, I understand exactly what you're saying. I guess my point would be, if we're going to say camouflage blending or whatever, there's going to be requirements and stipulations as to what that means.
So you're saying that we should allow vendors not to blend in?
Well, what I'm saying is, rather than trying to address every possible scenario in which they may try to do that in code, if we leave it open to staff during the negotiation of a lease agreement, then we get that flexibility and the opportunity to be protected as a city without trying to define every possible scenario in code, which I think could lead some unintended consequences.
Right, but then you're saying that whoever is negotiating the lease agreement then decides, and we have no input.
Design review committee anyway.
No, I know, but the design review committee follows code, whereas
Right.
a lease agreement negotiator, whatever.
But if they comply with code, if they say we are camouflaging this by making this look like a palm tree, and this is, and according to your code, that is allowed, then also we don't have much input onto whether or not
No,
that
so
works.
camouflage does not allow it to be a palm tree.
Kevin, go ahead.
I only brought up that because one of the options that Sarah was presenting is only requiring the stealth design in parks. I said, well, why does there need to be a code requirement in that case? Because you can just address it in the lease agreement. But I'm not saying create a special exception where the city willy-nilly can do whatever it wants.
Yeah, it gets to go into the lease agreement. Who is the
But
officer?
ultimately, so leasing property would ultimately a legislative decision unless it's delegated to
City
staff.
council. City council or staff?
If it's delegated to city staff, then the council can do that.
So the city still gets a
That's
say.
a legislative decision. Selling and disposing property is a legislative decision.
Okay, so the
Council
city,
gets a
the
say?
city still gets a say of what it's gonna look like.
Right.
So I think it addresses both.
Perhaps it would be solved by painting them all blue with the BYU logo.
Can you strike that from the record, please?
Mark, wouldn't that come under offensive stuff?
We need to
All
keep
right, let's
church and
move on.
state separated, that's all I'm saying.
So were there any other general comments about this? Because if not, I'd like to say.
So just so you're aware as well, I believe that the industry standard
Okay.
is, industry terminology is stealth design. That's what Sarah had found out in her research. Not camouflaging or blending,
Commissioner Funk.
Okay, first of all, I have a question on 190503, 3L, which is down from the camouflage area. And that's where you talk about the antenna cannot extend outward further than 4 feet from the monopole, or 6 feet if it's shielded. I just had a question. Is there anything to keep them from is there anything that we can do to require them, if they're going to put a 100-foot pole, I want them to put the stuff up at the top, because the farther up it is, the smaller it looks anyway.
The AT&T
Probably
application
wanted to-
actually has a microwave antenna lower than that big stack.
Do require co-location, which would be, there could be antenna lower on there. I'm assuming.
How
if
low
they
is
put
what
in
my
100
question
foot
is.
pole that, oh, no, we don't have a minimum.
And that's why, okay, if we say it could only be 4 feet out, well, that's fine if it's 100 feet up, but if it's, 50 feet up, and they may have something 100 feet up, but they may also have something 50 feet. Do we want to even less of a obtrusive?
I would feel very uncomfortable without, at this point, we're trying to micromanage businesses based upon technology and physics and stuff like that that none of us understand. I'm guessing if they're putting it at 50 feet, they've got a good reason why they want it at 50 feet. And for us to, by code, say, well, no, it looks better at 100 feet, we might cause all sorts of problems with radio technology and communication in our city.
And also,
Requiring co-location on the same pole, who's to say that putting it right next to the other one on the top isn't going to create some kind of induced electromagnetic field or interference?
there's I believe it's about a 10-foot separation is the standard distance for antenna. I mean, that's the owners deal with that. The lower you go in the tower, the less coverage you have. So if you're pulling the antenna, you're even reducing that coverage even further. So instead of being say 50 feet, it may act as if it's 30 feet. So they're not going to want to pull that antenna in if you go lower.
I think maybe you can see my concern, though, is that the lower down you get, if you get farther out, I mean, 4 feet at 40 feet up versus 4 feet at 100 feet up, you can see it a lot easier. I mean, it just, to me, I'm concerned about, we're concerned about what this is going to look like. That's why we've talked about camouflage.
I just don't think they would go to the trouble of building a 100-foot tower and then put antennas on 50 feet. They could get away with it.
But they could.
They could.
Put in
The last person co-locating is going to get that 50-foot spot.
Correct.
Everybody else is going to be, the first person on is going to be at 100, then 80, and they're going to incrementally be working down the pole. So I understand what you're saying. I mean, we did work with the industry on this to come up with that antenna arm length.
Right.
It makes sense. What you're saying makes sense, but I would say, I kind of agree with what Hayden was suggesting. 4 feet outside the pole is really not much, and 6 feet just gives us the shielding ability around it.
So what you're saying, though, is that that's fine. We're going to let the industry regulate themselves on it, and I'm just concerned that they, when we allow something, they can do it.
Scenario specifically, the industry is not regulated by themselves, they're regulated by physics, and they're regulated by electromagnetic engineering and stuff like that. And so if we're trying to legislate electromagnetic laws of physics, we could get ourselves in a lot of trouble. And so I'm not saying let the industry do whatever the heck they want, but what I'm saying is a lot of times they're going to be doing stuff based upon what the capability of the technology is, and we don't want to get in the way of that.
I'm not wanting to make it overly restrictive, but I'm just saying that if they've got the right to put things down real low, they may do it.
But I'm just assuming it's going to be a 4 or 8 foot thick pole. That's what I'm just assuming when we were coming up with these.
Well, let's let Commissioner Funk finish his thoughts.
Okay. Anyway, and we may want to think about that. I don't, if we don't put a regulation on it, they can do what they want, and I understand that they're going to do what's economically best for them.
Well, remember,
probably, but maybe not.
Remember last meeting, one of the pictures that Sarah showed was a flagpole, and then that Sprint guy said, yeah, so a flagpole works as long as you want a really thick flat flagpole. I think that's because they could go all the way down there at that maximum width. So you just have to assume it's going to be 8 feet wide.
I mean, and I have no problems on the restrictions that we have. I just have problems on how far down the pole are we going to let them come with that size. Because that's what is good for them, and that's okay. I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah, and I think the example that Sarah showed earlier in some of those pictures was, I believe, a 13-foot antenna extension that people have, and so, I mean, even this 4 foot is a substantial decrease from what's been going on in the city, and so I'm not disagreeing with you, but what I would suggest is maybe this is an incremental step, and if the first pole goes up and it's hideous, we can come back and revisit that and address that again at that point.
Okay. My second point was on the fall zone, which 1905-4, I think, was where it was at. Anyway, my concern is, part of the reason we were is for safety reasons. And I understand, I mean, I realize that we have certain restrictions, like it has to be over a 5-acre parcel to have a 100-foot tower. So if I had a 5-acre parcel and it was next to a commercial building that was well, let's just say it was right next to a commercial building, I could put the tower up within a few feet of that building and not have a problem because it's not residential, it's commercial. So I just have a concern about commercial, and I also have a concern about what would keep them from putting it up, 15, 20 feet from a street. Where that tower could fall over in the street, then we would have the problem of whatever that might cause. Do we want to also make that 200-foot distance from commercial as well as residential, and from streets as well as residential?
Were those all your comments?
No, I still have more. On the chain link fence, first of all, I am not opposed to chain link fence. The city came in and put a chain link fence, and it looks fine. They're going to come through, I hope, and put some kind of a fence on my side yard. If they don't put in a chain link fence, it will look strange because everything around there is chain link fence around all the residential area. And yet we're regulating and saying you can't put chain link fence right up next to a residence. We've done it in the past. I don't have an opposition to it, especially when it goes with what's already there. And yet we're regulating it and saying we can't do it.
So I don't know where you live, Commissioner Funk, but I was noticing that Sunrise Meadows has chain link, and it's vinyl dip chain link in times, and I just now noticed it. And so certainly if there's an existing fence, then I don't know if there's if they have the rights to put in a similar type fence, Kevin? Are they grandfathered into something?
Yeah, they're grandfathered in. They can replace it as long as they're not
replace it, but
expanding,
what
like,
about next to
the
it?
footprint of it. What's that now?
What about next to it?
Next to it? Yeah, now that would not
Extending out
be
from it.
grandfathered in.
Okay.
Yeah, if it's an existing fence, they can replace it.
No, I'm next to a city park. Supposedly.
So I think that concern is valid. On consistency.
I mean, according to what we're ruling here, they can't.
How many developments, Mark or staff, have chain link fences right now? Sunrise Meadows has it. What other developments have chain link fence? Is there any?
Nothing else comes to mind.
So, I mean, we may be dealing with just a very isolated case where Mr. Funk happens to live next to a park, and
I think staff was just trying to anticipate what the council's concern would be on that issue. If your recommendation is to allow chain link fence for public utility companies in the city, in all cases, even adjacent to residential developments, or residential uses, I should say, then that's certainly within your discretion to do so. I would like the planning commission though to address, I made the streets. A chain link can't go in if it's within 100 feet of a street. That would create some problems for us, and if that would require,
it's already done.
That would require an additional 100-foot front setback. It may actually make the public utility site larger in many cases. So I'm not sure that specific code requirement makes sense.
And maybe Mark can address what they're going to do, because they're going to put in a path, and I'm assuming they're going to put a fence up there.
Yeah, so thanks. We actually discussed this at staff, and I kind of, told my planning staff they were trying to draft this based on the feedback that they had gotten from you. and as they work through the issue. And I want to respect that there's been a lot of effort put in. Please understand we were trying to show what came out of the recommendations of you all. I do think that having it tied to right-of-way is doing exactly what Kevin says. It becomes problematic for us because, for example, now all of a sudden there's a roadway which is a right-of-way, which now triggers that we can't use that. So I would dare say in many of these instances it would still prohibit us from being able to use chain link on like a pond site or something like that, simply because we're going to have a right-of-way to be able to access that. So I don't think right-of-way is the right language. I think it should be tied to existing residential neighborhood or something along those lines as the barrier distance, because you know, for example, if we build a pond and then at some is on it, we were there first, we should be grandfathered in, you know, theoretically in that concept. But I don't think that it should be so broad to say as, you know, future zoned residential development, because virtually everything that we're building will have some point in the future some encroachment potentially near it. So at that point, I think it becomes very difficult for us as well. So those are the things that we've discussed. It's a complex issue, and we want to respect your recommendation as far as moving forward.
Do we want to word it anywhere where it would?
Do you want my opinion, or do you, I mean, because what you've got in front of you is the kind of the consolidated opinion of what we've come to.
I don't like what we have in front of us.
I would
what
suggest,
I'm saying.
I would suggest you change the language to 200 feet of existing residential development.
And we could
to make that not work for my area.
Is that what it is?
It also says future, doesn't it?
From the
or right away.
Yes.
And that isn't that way right now.
Yeah, I don't like the 100 feet from right away from the reasons you mentioned. Now, if we did want to do something like define exactly maybe specific types of streets, like a main collector or something like that, that might make a little bit more sense. But
I have proposed changing right-of-way to street. I think Mark's trying to point out his preference is that we not require that.
And I can see the value of having a limit, like how close it can be to certain streets. Like, for instance, Redwood Road, we may not want chain link fence right up on Redwood Road or right off some major collector. Smaller street that's less traveled, then I don't think it should come into effect. And so maybe defining specific certain types of streets or something like that might accomplish what we're looking for. I don't know, I'm just spitballing
here.
here.
Say collectors or arterials, but I would want feedback on.
I would disagree with that.
No, but then, you know, there's a pump station, a city pump station right next to my lot. I wouldn't want a chain link fence there.
But it wouldn't.
It's right against. No, it's right next to it.
It's 200 feet from existing residential development. If they're already there, they can't do it.
Yeah, but okay, but even for future, I mean.
What if it's future and there's nobody there?
I don't want to say, haha, you can't do what.
It's a disclosure conversation. If you were to have built your chain link fence before you even pulled the contract to build your home, would you care if it was wrought iron or chain link?
Right, but if we have these little pockets of public lands everywhere, and like Sarah was saying, that we could build these little buildings and pump stations and things all over the city, then pretty soon there won't be any residential areas that's not going to be touched by a chain link fence, right? So.
And what we're suggesting.
In the middle of the neighborhood, I mean.
Yeah.
200 feet.
You're gonna have chain link fences everywhere.
Possibly. Isn't it the homeowner's responsibility who buys that house next to the chain?
Sure. Right. So then, but then what kind of residents is Saratoga Springs only going to attract?
I don't think
we're okay with chain link fence.
I don't know.
Right?
Commissioner Funk doesn't seem to mind.
No, I know. Well, we're saying that we could allow that all throughout the city, so there's really no choice.
Well, one, I don't think there's going to be that much public areas like this. I mean, I don't think this is going to be everywhere. I think there's going to be some of it, but I don't think it's going to be everywhere.
Okay, I'd like to say something. I always like to know, before we pull out the fence post, why we put the fence post in place. So originally, from what I understand, we wanted to keep this city beautiful. We wanted to have wrought iron fences to have a look and a feel of a nice city. At least that's from my understanding. I don't know the full history. I don't know the rationale of why that was put in place in the beginning. What had been proposed to us originally to make any change to chain link fence was for utilities and for decreasing the amount of cost to the city. Now, it seems we've opened the floodgates for chain link fences in the city, and I don't think that's I don't think that was what the intended proposal was. The intended proposal was to allow for chain link fences to decrease tax requirements, to help utilities, and not necessarily to let that explode throughout neighborhoods and wherever else. So I think we're off track.
Mr. Chair, I agree with you.
I think we should focus on what this intent was. The intent was for the utilities. So I propose that we keep it at that, and we can deal with any kind of other chain link fence issue in the future, but I don't think that's what we intended. I don't think we meant to open up the floodgates. So that's my.
That's a good recommendation if you want to discuss chain link for the entire city.
I hope we could bring it back, but I would like to
Right now
review
it's
it. But I don't think
prohibited.
that's what we're here to do tonight.
I thought this whole conversation was around public building stuff like that. I didn't know we were talking about.
But it's within, if you live in a subdivision and your covenants and restrictions or your homeowners association says that you cannot have chain link, and yet there's a little site at the corner of your subdivision, and all of a sudden, now it has chain link. It isn't compatible with the rest of the subdivision. Now, if the whole, like Mr. Funk, his whole subdivision, or many of his neighbors have chain link. It probably would look better with a chain link. I think compatibility is the issue.
Yeah, and that's what I'm trying to bring up.
And I think that's a good point. I also think that for example, on a major roadway or something like that, I think the council is going to opt to have it look really good. And I don't think that they're necessarily going to say, hey, we're just going to put chain link everywhere. We're talking about ponds. We're talking about those instances where it doesn't make sense for us to be spending top dollar on infrastructure that will never be, from an aesthetic value, addressed. And that's kind of the focus of what the intent was.
That's what
on
the
this
code
particular
amendments
approach.
are saying, right? So
correct. I believe so.
Yeah. So I think that if we go with what these amendments say, then that's exactly what we're doing. We're covering exactly what those comments that you made.
Right. And so, and Sarah, if I was misinterpreting it, you're saying that it does allow, it does indicate that chain link is only allowed within 200 feet of residential. Is that correct? Existing residential.
200 feet from existing.
Okay.
For facilities more than 200 feet from existing development, and then the subsection under that says chain link is not permitted adjacent.
Originally, our conversation was based on residential zone. 200 feet from residential zone, but there's the project that you said.
Yeah, I would say existing residential.
That's where it changed to development.
Well, the reason for that is because
Right,
the vast majority of the
because-
city is zoned at some point going to be residential.
Striking zone because the pond that's being proposed doesn't
Right.
have any existing development around it, but it's in a residential zone
Right.
itself. So if we put,
It's actually in
then it
ag.
then none of our sites can use it. All of our ponds and things like that are in residential zones.
Unless we rezone little pockets like she was
So
saying.
what if, so it is in ag?
Well, and I apologize. It's currently being used as ag. Kara's indicating it's a 110, a 110 zone.
Right.
But we're not talking. I mean, you asked my opinion. I'm not suggesting that it's future zoning. I'm saying, in those areas, if it's not within that, then we're building the infrastructure. And again, we're not talking chain link. We're talking vinyl coated chain link, which in and of itself has that decorative, quality towards that. It's the conversation. And I'm going off of what was in the packet. I don't know if you've made changes up here, and I apologize for that. But the right of way was the one thing that we thought was challenging, or in my opinion is challenging, because there's right of way, in the proposed pond site that we're talking about. And so if you're telling us that we've automatically, by adding the right-of-way, 100 feet right-of-way conversation into it, we've disqualified our ability to use chain link, then don't even bother passing the whole rest of this, because it doesn't do us any good if it's within that right-of-way conversation. Unless you put the clause in that says arterial or collector, then it's not going to help us, because anytime there's a road next to it, you've got right-of-way, and that triggers then the wrought iron fence.
So really what we're trying to do is we're trying to get some flexibility for the city to be able to use chain link in place that would be cost effective. That's really what we're trying to do. Is that what our code is doing?
Not with the right-of-way conversation
So,
included.
What do we need to do?
It depends on perspective. So this with the pond site, if you were to apply this to the pond site, it would mean the first 100 feet adjacent to the right-of-way would need to be wrought iron style, or if that's what we chose to use, or something other than chain link. And then beyond 100 feet, it could be chain link. So it could allow for 2 types of fencing around the site. I don't know if you know.
So
if
Sarah, do you suggest
partial?
do you suggest that this needs some more looking at, that we need to look at it some more, and so we actually are creating code that it
We've got a little bit of a timeline.
no.
And
And they need to get started on that, and that is
Right. So what do we do?
What was the reasoning behind the 100-foot right of way?
Because a lot of these need fencing adjacent to the right-of-way. So we have 2 facilities on the corner of Foothill Boulevard and Pony Express. So a lot of people travel that road because they're going to the high school or the junior high or the elementary school, or residents traveling out to Eagle Mountain, and those front the right-of-way. And so it's a question of do we want chain link up right along the, and then if we don't, how far back should it go? So we can pull up a few of these and show you. And then the other thing, so we have a water tank, for example, and it's right now clear up the hill. In the future, it's going to have residential around it. This pond that we're looking at right now, it doesn't have any residential around it at the moment, but it's zoned residential, so it will. So the question is, when there are homes next to it, and you drive through that neighborhood, what's next to the street?
What is that street going to be? Is it going to be a fully paved city right-of-way, or is it going to be paved pad type?
It's going to be a city street.
It is going to be a city.
It is currently a city street.
All the way up to the.
Yeah, it just doesn't have your sidewalk, curb and gutter. I just quickly drew on a map what it would look like, and so let me show you what the outcome of what the proposal.
We appreciate the compliment where we're not the council, we're the commission.
So if you look at this blue line, what this says is for the first 100 feet, correction, the first 100. That makes sense. So that's what this language.
How much extra would that cost for that small amount? 200 feet of.
It's a small amount in this case, but it could be another case where it could be
Small
huge.
amount here, but again, you're changing.
Well, so also you've got the different maintenance stuff, and I think it'd look horrible.
I
think
agree.
it'd actually-
I think aesthetically it looks awful.
It'd look worse
Might as
that
well be
way.
one or the other.
So, how about this? And it sounds. Let me propose this as a counter argument, because we've got essentially in our code here, we've defined a couple different types of public buildings and stuff like that. One of which, very minimum setbacks, can be sitting right in a residential neighborhood. Others, larger buildings, stuff like that. What if we were to do something like exclude the smaller 200-foot unoccupied ones that are going to be sitting right in a public neighborhood without any setbacks, exclude stuff like that from chain link?
It doesn't help this argument, which is the pond.
Well, we'd have to kind of figure out the whole pond thing, because it's kind of outside of that current thing, where ponds, bigger buildings, and stuff like that could qualify, because now they've got setbacks and stuff like that, where the small little things that it sounds like from what you were telling me, that was kind of more your concern, those might not apply, and which we wouldn't be able to use just normal chain link
Or
around
we just
those.
go with the recommendation where we say certain streets like collect, or you actually, I think you brought it up first. If it's a major street, then it's required, and if it's not, then it's not.
Well, it sounds like there's two, I was hearing two different concerns. One was the 200 feet from residential, and whether or not we were okay with that. And the other was 100 feet from a right-of-way. And I think that, yeah, the arterial collector would probably solve the majority of those issues. I'm talking about the other concern with 200 feet from residential. If I heard you correctly, you're a little uncomfortable with that. And so the second scenario would be smaller things like that.
Let me interrupt for a minute. Has something to say. We would be
you're-
wise to listen to him.
Certainly don't have to make a decision on every aspect of this. You could table some portions of this ordinance and send a positive recommendation on the rest of it to the council.
I love that
That's an option,
proposition.
or you could send it forward as drafted, and each of you could follow up with an email expressing your concern to the council so they can consider some of these different options that you're proposing. So there's a lot of different things you can do. Consider that to make a decision tonight if there's not a consensus.
So
With respect to the time that we have left.
To give some perspective, I pulled up 2 examples. So this is vinyl coated chain link along Sunrise Meadows. And then the example we were talking about, and then this is a wrought iron Foothill and Pony Express. So I think the purpose was that if you're going to have fence along the right of way or adjacent to the street or viewable from the, you know, a large amount of the public or something like that, is there a preference for, so I pulled these up just for, I guess, a visual example.
How did that chain link fence get in there in the first place? I mean, because the
That
code
was
doesn't allow
before
it.
That was prohibited.
What's that?
It's grandfathered. It was before that was added to the code.
Okay.
So here's a black vinyl coated chain link, and then the other was the wrought iron style. And so you have those kind of 2 visuals to
I don't
to help
see
with the
enough
discussion.
difference there to really concern me that much.
Oh, I do. I see a huge difference.
Okay, so we don't agree on this one so much. So I believe that our counselor, and let's I propose that we
Well, on
pull
this
section.
one, if we could, if it's possible to come to a consensus and at least make a recommendation to the council, because the council is going to be very opinionated about this topic as well, and I am not sure I could predict how it's going to go there either. If you could move it forward, that would actually help, because I don't know that tabling it brings us to a consensus.
That's true.
May I suggest something a little different?
Commissioner Steele.
We could do one of 2 things. Sites that include open water probably should have a chain link. And maybe we do it by size if something's over, then for cost purposes, then chain link. And things under an acre, and then next to a residential and next to a road, have the chain link, or have the wrought iron.
But that would require writing more code or whatever. Okay, so
On the fly.
Also, Commissioner Funk, if that fence wasn't chain link, if it was wrought iron, would you hate it? Okay, well, it was chain link at a time when those were allowed, but it's no longer allowed. And you would not be against having wrought iron if that, because that's what the code requires nowadays.
I would be against having chain link to a point and then wrought iron from that point.
But
I would be against that.
Yeah, but current code,
especially when it's right next to my yard is where it's going to be.
But current code is that it's all wrought iron, so we could just leave it the way it is. You're just not against chain link in a residential area.
Okay, let's stop for a second. I think we all have our opinions. We do want this to move forward. We can vote on this. Hold on. We can vote on this. Everybody can, and then they can express why they voted the way that they did, and we can move on a positive or a negative recommendation based upon a motion. I think we've discussed this fully. So if you have any other general comments, I'll entertain those. But then I want to move on to a motion.
Can I ask one question before I make a motion?
Before you do, we had one
We've
question.
we've gotten to the commissioners on the end with just general comments yet.
Yes, we haven't.
If we don't
I wrote a
have to
bunch of
have
stuff up,
everybody's
but I
comments.
think a lot of what for comments has been covered. I already talked about what I thought about camouflaging. Actually, for the chain link, I'm good with the vinyl covered chain link. I do like the idea, though, maybe if we do something with a lot size, but I mean, I say revisit that later. We do have to move this on.
Okay, so I never did get to say what I wanted to say about cell phone towers. I agreed with Commissioner Funk as far as a radius around a cell phone tower in a commercial zone. If it were in a commercial zone, I still believe that it still has to have at least the radius of a setback based upon the height of the tower. I don't want the tower falling in any building or any other commercial use or any people. It would, I think, or roads. The applicant for the next item on our agenda admit that he has seen several of these burned down to the ground. We've seen it on YouTube. So for safety reasons, I believe that still needs to have a setback that makes it so it's safe if it falls or burns. Second thing, in the cell towers, what happens in the event that there's a lot line adjustment? Say that you have a cell tower that's already put into a 5-acre parcel. Now there's a lot line adjustment or some subdivision and they're changing the use of the land. Does that make the cell phone tower no longer a permitted use in that area if they're changing the purpose of the land?
It would make it so that we can't approve something that creates I don't know if we could even approve it.
Okay, so does the current code make sure that the purpose of the code, let's say that they changed it to a residential?
So if it was agriculture, or if it was a 5-acre lot and they wanted to subdivide it and put a bunch of lots in,
Yes.
the cell tower would have to come down.
Okay. But is that supported in the code? Does the code say that? Because that would be an administrative, I guess that would be a legislative decision because you're changing the use of the land.
So if the height of the cell tower, if you can put a 100-foot cell tower on a 5-acre lot and somebody wants to just subdivide that in less than 5 acres, that means for the cell tower.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. We'd have to kind of flesh that out a little bit more. But if it can't meet the setback requirements, then no, you couldn't subdivide that further.
Thank you.
For the minimum lot size requirements of the existing divided without the tower coming down, without that use being extinguished.
Okay. Commissioner Williamson, did you get your question in?
My question was, before we get to a motion, if I were to make a motion with changes as made tonight and, condition or two, is everyone comfortable with the changes that have been made to the code, or are there specific conditions that we need to include above and beyond based upon our conversation tonight?
I can go through what I...
There were a couple of...
And then there's something else. We had a letter that was sent to us today that they asked be counted as public testimony. Now, do we have to read that into the record, or can we just put that?
That's on 6, I think. The way I read it, it was towards it. Yeah.
That's item 6.
Well, it was on 6. I thought it was on the code, period.
AT&T cell tower at the Crossroads Boulevard.
And what about do we need to say something about what we received from Mr. Evans tonight and what we received by email? You have both of them? Very good. Thank you.
So to answer your question, I'm okay with the changes in the code.
Okay, so
I'd like to answer your question too. As long as we could make some kind of change, Sarah, I don't know about the commercial, if that cell tower still has a radius or setback equal to or greater than the height of the tower.
Just include that in your motion if that's what you want to do. That would delegate it.
Setback from another use.
From an existing building,
or future.
Or street.
Or even just their property. You wouldn't want it to fall on, just like you wouldn't want water to go onto an adjacent property. You wouldn't want the cell tower to fall. If it does, you're liable. So.
Okay, let me go through what I have up
Am I
here.
wrong?
So I added this, this section doesn't apply to cell towers, right? So public utility buildings and facilities, this section doesn't apply to cell towers. So
if it can't be
close to a building, close to residential, or close to a street, where are they gonna go?
Somewhere
Oh.
they can fall
5-acre
down.
lot. If you have a 5-acre mound.
Yeah,
where-
can I point out something there? Say you had a 100-foot cell tower, just doing a quick calculation, if the concern is, well, if that falls over, we don't want it to hit anything, you're gonna have 31,400 square feet of no man's land around that tower, where you can't have anything.
2 pi r.
I mean, yeah, geography, or, yeah, not geography, I'm a geographer. Geometry. So, yeah, there's always a concern about safety, but I can probably rationalize probably from a residence, the tower, the height of the tower, but you look all around, you've got cell towers everywhere in commercial zones. One, because it helps actually hide the tower when you're in a commercial zone. There's always going to be an issue then that a tower could fall on somebody or something, but I don't think it's reasonable to say, we have a 100-foot tower, now you got to have 31,000 square feet of no man's land where you can't have anything.
The 100-foot tower has to be on a unreasonable to have a setback away from a commercial building or any other building.
It might be,
Right.
if you want to develop that 5 acres on commercial.
Right, it might be because if you look at the Walmart site, for example, you might end up putting it in the middle of the parking lot if you do that, which it's actually less noticeable next to the side of the building. That's just an example.
Well, and
Well, we'll
we're
address that.
assuming, and
We'll
we're
address
assuming
that in the motion.
Yeah, and, okay.
And I struck, for vinyl coated chain link, I struck or zoning. So 200 feet from existing residential. If the facility is more than 200 feet from existing residential. And then I changed this from right of way to street. In the other section, so we discussed camouflage. I added if you're putting an antenna on an existing light fixture in a right of way or a sports field, that you can't increase the height of the light when you're replacing the pole. Discussed camouflaging, and if any changes are recommended here, we should. And then.
So did you take out the required in parks? Is that still in there?
Still there. I can strike that. It's up to you guys. So that can be recommended to be that it's required in parks, or we can change it from camouflage to blending, or we can, as the term is stealth design.
Oh, I like that.
So we can change even just all the words that say camouflage to stealth design, and that's an option.
For the purposes of my motion that I'm going to make, will you strike that? I just want to be able to say as amended.
Strike this?
Yeah.
Strike that it's required in a park?
In a park. They can get voted up or voted down.
And then, so I addressed those typos that were mentioned. We talked about, well, Commissioner Kilgore briefly mentioned spacing versus clustering, and that we didn't receive. And we added lattice towers greater than 35 feet.
Will you also
We'll let those addressed.
Another change I'd like to have made for my motion specifically would be on the 100-foot setback from a street. I would like that to specify specifically arterials and collectors as opposed to just street.
Okay. And
That was up higher.
that's chain link.
Yeah.
The other section.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, one more thing we did. We talked about deleting letter D in this definition. So public and private utilities, buildings, or facilities. So we talked about deleting letter D so that so that there wasn't a potential that monopoles could be considered. But I'm wondering if this sentence in particular applies to other facilities.
I think I asked that you put in there that it excluded monopoles.
Well, I would say
you're
that
just going to
we're-
have to make your motion, and
for the
that's what it's
purposes of
gonna
my
be.
motion, I like that left as
So-
is, just because I feel like we handle with the
So-
setbacks everywhere else.
You've at least indicated all the changes that you've proposed tonight, right, Sarah? We've gone over them.
So, yes, we've gone over all the changes I proposed. We can change this suggested.
Let's see what happens in the motion.
To arterial and collector.
Okay, I'll entertain a motion.
Okay.
Wait, does
and this-
arterial and collectors also include road
Well, now the quarter wouldn't be an arterial or collector.
It won't be.
Highway, freeway.
Okay, I guess what I meant is, does it include freeway?
So you can say streets
Collector? Would that be?
larger than a local street?
We're getting closer. Let's keep going.
And so it's 19, what sections are we viewing right now? I was looking for the motion, I couldn't find it. 1915.
1902 and 1905.
2.
I'm going to ask why you didn't want to change the definition, because that leaves the door wide open.
Well, because we're taking care of like the setbacks and everything like that with poles in that other section.
No, you look at the definition of public utilities, and we're leaving, right now, the way it is, you're leaving the definition with the cell towers in there, or could.
Ambiguous.
It
For
is,
clarity,
and
I
it
would-
needs to be.
Well, but from what Kevin was telling us, it's more specific. It's looking for more specific, and so we've much more specific in there and saying is, all right, here are the requirements for lot size and stuff like that for cell phone towers, and.
Do you want to open it up for a lawsuit? I mean, to be decided in court, because that's what will happen.
Kevin, will you weigh in on that?
We can look in, so I'll look into this further. I don't think that this should hold up your decision tonight, but we can certainly strengthen the ordinance as we move forward towards council approval.
It's simple, just either amend that one sentence, or you don't want to delete it, because our regular phone company may need a transmission, something.
Well, but it's all.
Or something that's small, but we don't want somebody coming in and saying that will allow that a cell tower will come in under a public utility building or facility. It's real simple. We can put an exception in there, just like we did in the language.
So I added F, wireless telecommunication facilities are not considered a public or private utility building or facility.
Thank you. That would take care of it.
Appeased? We good? I'll entertain a motion.
I move that we forward a positive recommendation on code items 1902 and 1905 to the city council as amended during our discussion today.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a second. Any question on the motion?
Yes, change 2.
So I'm sorry to throw a wrench in this, but I actually don't recommend that addition by Sarah, because of public utility company's ability to install small cell facilities in the public utility easements. The Public Service Commission has issued a ruling on that, as well as the Federal Trade Commission. So I would like to look into that further before we just go forward with that. If it is a concern, after I've researched a little bit more, I read Ken Evans' email just a few minutes before Planning Commission started.
Commissioner,
If it's a concern, then I can certainly make that recommendation to the council.
Thank you.
Though, at least we can't just create this huge carve out, or this huge, I guess it may need to be more specific than just that.
Okay.
Commissioner Williamson, will you adopt that?
I am okay
suggestion?
with that.
And our second?
Yep.
And back to your question. We
I'd like
wanted
to
to
see
see what
what-
happened to camouflage.
Yes.
The language that said it's required to be camouflaged in parks. So just bottom.
Let me read that first and see what.
And will you?
Okay,
Is your question satisfied?
I can go with that.
And I would like to we changed that street to not be streets, but collectors or arterial and collector. I'd like at least that to be.
Are you amending your motion?
I am clarifying when I said my motion what I intended.
And is our second in agreement with that?
Sure.
Any other questions? All in favor? Aye.
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 Any opposed?
Aye. I oppose.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, can we, oh,
Chain link is not permitted adjacent to or within 100 feet of streets that are larger than local streets.
We are
No.
past
I'm
that
acceptable.
point. We're past, we've already had the motion and it's passed. What are you, what are you asking, Sarah?
She's just saying we passed it
Are you
before she
asking
really got
to-
a chance
you're asking?
Well, he clarified, did he clarify after the motion passed? Or
No, I said before. We talked about that before.
He
That
clarified
is
it.
consistent with my
I thought you were going to
intent.
state
Clarified
it
it
in your
before the
motion,
motion
so I
passed.
hadn't typed it in.
So the planning commission has the opportunity to revisit the motion if they like. Otherwise, they could just leave it as is. I think the delegation of staff was pretty specific on that it doesn't apply to collectors and arterials.
Is this something we want to revisit? Okay.
So
Thank you very
Needs
much.
to be in the motion.
So do you want to revisit the motion? Let's, okay. We have a motion. Do we have a second? Do we have a second? We do not. The motion does not pass. So it goes as it was passed. Which is how you originally did it without that language.
The motion was
Your
not
motion mentioned
for higher,
arterial
which
and
is larger than a local
collector
street.
roads, so that'll just be added in later. I heard him make
He
that
did.
motion, sir.
He did. Before the motion was passed, he
You know what our intent is.
It needs to be, the motion needs to reflect the, I need to,
Kevin, do we need to
because it's
reconsider?
code language, it needs to be.
I'm going to
approved
defer
how you
to our
want it.
counsel.
I thought he made that in his motion, but
I thought he did too.
I commented on my intent. I did not specifically state that in the motion.
Okay, so the
Just redo it.
amended motion failed, so it passed without that change.
Motion to reconsider item number 5.
I'll entertain that.
I move.
Sorry, the planning commission bylaws actually require the original count planning.
I have to ask,
This
request to
one's
revisit.
fun.
We are learning also all about Robert's Rules of Order tonight. I move that we reconsider item number 5 for a
Second.
motion.
We have a motion, and
Second.
can we take a second that is separate from the original?
I
wasn't the
can't
original.
remember. I think it's probably the original commission member that seconded it.
Second.
We have second. Is there a
I'm-
question on the motion?
yes, now what are we voting on?
Let's hear it.
I move that we pass a positive recommendation. You got me all flustered now. For items or code amendments 1902 or amendments to code 1902 and 1905 as amended in the staff packet.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Oh, we have to,
That was answering the question.
It needs to be seconded.
Oh,
and then
1915?
We still need a second.
Already did second. We were
No, not
answering
the
a
second
question.
time around.
No, this is,
We have
that
to
was a
pass the motion
second
to
to
reconsider
revisit
before we
it.
can
Now
have
we
a
have a new,
motion.
excuse me. We did a second to reconsider it. Now we've reconsidered it and we have a new motion, which is part of the
And
consideration.
I already said, I guess I'll second.
So you will
Okay.
second
And then-
this one as
and then
well.
there was a
This
question.
is a second motion.
Right, and then there was a question.
Now
What
the
are we,
question.
the question was, what are we, and then he explained
What
it.
is that now amended to read streets that are larger than local streets?
Yes.
Okay, would you like to include 1915 in your motion as well?
Yes.
Thank you.
Sorry, is that okay with the second?
Yes.
Any other questions? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Oppose.
A.
That's
Mr. Chair, could I
Yes.
take the mayor would like a few minutes.
That's what I was
come
about
in.
to get
Okay.
to myself.
Okay.
We'd like to recognize, that our mayor is here and he has some matters of city business. What's that? Okay, so everyone was in the affirmative except for Commissioner Funk, who had a negative vote. And Commissioner Steele, okay. Motion still passes with, all right.
I will admit it's much more entertaining on that side, watching this show. Thank you. On behalf of the council and myself, I just wanted to stop by tonight and tell Commissioner Funk, thank you for your service. We had a plaque made. It didn't get here in time, but Mark has assured. But thank you for your service, and then also to introduce the new planning commissioner that will be filling the remainder of Commissioner Funk's term, Brianne Brush. New last name from when we first met. So if she has a minute to introduce her to you guys. But again, we appreciate it. Title 19 is a cuss word for the council. I'm sure it's a cuss word for staff, cuss word for you guys as I've watched you guys debate the issues. We appreciate it as a council. Comments been made. You guys have done very well at getting code really refined so that it's not taking us till midnight constantly to go through code. So thank you from the council. Your work is greatly appreciated.
Before we do an introductions, thank you, Commissioner Funk.
Hi, nice to meet you. I guess I should ask, what do you want to know? That's right. Wow. Well, let me go back. No, I'm originally from Phoenix, Arizona, and I moved here to Utah last May to accept an internship in the mayor's office in Provo City. And I've been there for the last year and a half, as well as completing another position at the Salt Lake Chamber, where I worked on a lot of legislative affairs. And now I'm in the mayor's office, and I moved here to Saratoga Springs in November, bought my first house. So I'm just really excited to be a part of a new and growing community and get my start here as well.
You could touch on your education as a
said
runner.
life history, so I went right with life history. But I have a bachelor's degree in economics from Boise State University, and then I just completed my master's of public administration with an emphasis in urban planning from Arizona State.
I thought that was relevant. She's also
probably more relevant than my life.
Also a very strong runner.
Yes, I ran collegiately for Boise State.
Okay, well, welcome.
Thank you. Any questions? You've discussed it at length so much already. I think I'll wait until next time when I'm
Good
up
answer.
there.
All right, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. And then we're going to come back and visit item number 6. So 5 minutes.
Sandra, what changed?
Because if that would be, that the executive have a local street and have
Turn off the recording. What was going on?
What was your issue?
I might have two. The chain link